Welcome, everyone. My name is John Mollenkopf, and it is my privilege to teach political science and sociology and direct the Center for Urban Research at the CUNY Graduate Center. As many of you may know, the Graduate Center is the primary PhD granting body of the City University system and also offers 17 master's programs. Tonight's event is part of the Graduate Center's Present series of public conversations and is presented both by the Office of Public Programs and our Center for Urban Research. We hope to welcome back everyone to the Graduate Center's home on 34th Street soon, but this virtual format allows audiences from all around the world to join us. We encourage you to tune in for more events this semester. At the Graduate Center, we take our commitment to education and research for the public good very seriously, and tonight's event is no exception. Tonight, we have some wonderfully knowledgeable panelists to discuss a profoundly important topic, the recognition that many Americans identify as belonging to more than one race, one of the highlighted findings of the recently released 2020 census. Nationwide, 33.8 million people, or 10.2% of the total population counted in 2020, were classified as having more than one race. Here in New York City, that number is 949,000, or 11.5% of our population. And two New York City counties, Queens and Brooklyn, are also among the top 5 counties for racial diversity in the continental United States. In part, these national and citywide measures of our multiracial population reflect better measurement by the census, not a huge actual change from the lower numbers reported previously. But they represent an important reality. The meanings of race are changing, and the boundaries between them may be getting a bit fuzzier in some cases. Here to discuss the implication of these newly understood statistics are 4 superb panelists. Jenifer Bratter is well known as a path-breaking sociologist studying who multiracial people are and how they understand themselves and how they are understood by others and measured by statistical systems. Though she's a professor at Rice University and got her PhD at the University of Texas, we can claim her as one of our own because she grew up in Brooklyn and graduated from Brooklyn Tech. Richard Alba, our renowned professor of sociology at the Graduate Center, is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and is one of the most influential observers and interpreters of demographic change in the United States. His recently published book, The Great Demographic Illusion: Majority, Minority, and Expanding the American Mainstream, is a provocative and revealing study of these trends that we'll be discussing tonight. Lurie Daniel Favors is the executive director of the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College of CUNY. She's been a powerful thought and action leader in working for fair representation of people of African descent in coalition with voting rights advocates from the Latino and Asian American communities. And Michael Lee joins us from the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center, affiliated with NYU. At Brennan, he has been a leading voice advocating for fuller and better representation of minority communities across the country. So let's begin with Jenifer, whom I'd like to ask, what do the new numbers on the multiracial population tell you about who makes up the multiracial population? Tell us something about their experiences and how they fit into older ideas about racial boundaries.
Thank you, John. First, I wanted to thank you for the invitation and also thank Richard, Lurie, and Michael. It's a real privilege to share the virtual stage with you. And of course, thank you to the audience for tuning in. So I'd like to contextualize this question a little more broadly. I think the question about who multiracial people are and how they're doing, or even questions like how are they fitting into the racial order or US racial society, is grounded, I think, in a larger notion that they represent an exceptional case of racial identifying that's really indicative of the ways the United States in particular constructs the notion of what it is to be multiracial. The way that we as people in the United States think about being multiracial is heavily contextualized by the fact that the US is both very racially unequal and also highly racially segregated. So the mixed person always appears as the exception. We understand racial communities of having hardened lines around them, and so cases where people are racially mixed always are understood as rare. Now, the reality is that mixed race people are a stable part of the US racial landscape, both historically and currently. And so what's changing, as your opening comments conveyed, is how we're thinking about racial mixture that translates into being an identity that's more frequently embraced. But we can also think about the fact that a lot of our focus on the biracial population misses large swaths of the multiracial population because we focus too much, I would argue, on the offspring of interracially coupled parents. While the offspring of mixed race couples are important, and a substantial share of the population can actually trace their mixture back beyond the parental generation to grandparents and to even great-grandparents. And this is a form of mixture we often don't really think about, but by neglecting it, we really do miss the ways in which people are sort of thinking about mix as being multi-generational. And in addition, we also miss the fact that multiracial people are not just offspring, but they're also parents, they're grandparents, and it raises the question as to whether multiracial can be transmitted across generations. Lastly, I would say that our understanding of being multiracial too heavily draws on the notion of, or this question of how a mixed race person is doing as being indicative of this sort of unique experience of navigating sort of two different worlds, or that the appearance of being multiracial signals that race is declining in importance. I think this misses the fact that multiracial identities manifest in lots of different ways, some of which we can gather in our data, some of which we're still working on finding good measures for, from being firmly rooted in single heritage communities to having ties to multiple communities. And these often shift and change in ways that our data are still trying to capture. But also the well-being of the multiracial population is in large part a reflection of the fact that they are reared in some really unique socioeconomic environments. And so last thing I would just kind of close with is that although we often think about multiracial as indicating that race matters less, it indicates that race continues to matter. And we see a lot of the racialized distinctions in the monoracial population reflected in the multiracial population as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Now let's turn to Richard Alba. Richard, much of your book focuses on the anxieties that the white majority feels about the possibility that they may become a minority. And I want to ask you how the growth of the multiracial population affects the way we all, not just whites, but all of us understand that the larger ethno-racial divisions in US society and how they're changing.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of get into a dialogue, I think, a bit with Jenifer about this, because I think that in the 21st century, that multiraciality really represents something different from what it has represented historically in the United States. I mean, there's absolutely no question about the importance of race today in our society and in the past. But in the past, multiraciality tended to be ruled by the so-called one-drop rule, which meant that multiracial people were typically seen as part of the minority population rather than the white population. And I think what makes it different today is that this really, I don't think, is as true as it has been, and much more than in the past. Multiracial young people, because actually they're concentrated among young people, are being brought up by parents from and kin who belong to different ethno-racial populations. So in that sense, I think it really is modifying the racial order of American society. And I want to point out that the bulk of the young multiracial population has a white parent and a non-white parent, which means that they're really spanning, you know, the great divide in American society between whites and people of color. That has important implications for how multiracial young people develop in our country. So that brings me now to the question you asked about whites. All of the social psychological research that we have about white anxiety is based on a view of American society as divided between whites and non-whites. And I see the multiracial population as challenging and potentially altering the way we perceive American society. I think this binary view that we are either white or not white is sort of at the heart of the white anxiety about the changing demography. Indeed, we have some interesting research by Morris Levy and Dal Myers that shows that how you frame demographic change matters a great deal for how whites respond to a narrative. And without question, when you frame it in terms of a binary between whites and non-whites, and you point out that the white population is becoming a smaller overall part of the population, that tends to heighten white anxiety and also to make whites actually more conservative, more concerned about racial stereotypes. But when you frame it in terms of blending and point out that blending has been a part of the American experience, then whites, in fact, do not respond with as much anxiety as before. So I think part of the importance of the multiracial population is going to be shifting the way we think about American society and moving it away from a binary and more toward a society where there's a great deal of blending.
Thank you for that, Richard. New York State has just altered the boundaries of congressional, state, Senate, and assembly districts to reflect the new contours of the population that was reported in the 2020 census, and soon New York City will do the same thing for city council districts. Lurie, you've been a very important voice in this process, and I'm wondering, obviously the process of redistricting is kind of stamping political boundaries on top of a changing population to some extent. What would you say are the challenges of empowering Black communities as their composition becomes more diverse, including not only those who report having more than one race, but also the fact that many Black New Yorkers come from immigrant origin families, from the Caribbean, from Africa, and from Spanish-speaking countries. So it's sort of not like the dawn of the civil rights era where there were Black communities that were primarily descended from people who had moved north from the South, or were living in segregated neighborhoods in southern cities. But it's a more fluid situation, and I'm really curious to hear whether or how that's been an aspect of the work that you've been doing.
So it is, and that's one of the reasons, and I should also first start by saying thank you for hosting this forum. It's a real pleasure to be here on the panel, but it actually is quite relevant to the redistricting process. And that's one of the reasons why we don't draw our maps based on race, because our communities are much more than that. And for community, that's one of the reasons also that I use the phrase often, people of African descent, to describe people who would be phenotypically described as Black people. And I'll get to that in just a moment. But, you know, Black identity generally is a creation of colonization and enslavement. And prior to those two sister atrocities, Black people as a concept don't exist. We often forget there's a before white supremacy where people were Hausa, Fulani, Yoruba, Ibu, Ashanti, Akan, Mandingo, but they were not Black. That is something that happened in response to the great interruption, as I call it, with the use of white supremacy as a tool to rank people and create hierarchies for the pursuit of power. So just like our Germanic, French, Czechoslovakian, and other European tribes that we can readily recognize throughout European history, we were very tribal communities. And so New York City in general, and Brooklyn in particular, shout out to Brooklyn, is home to one of the largest gatherings of Pan-African communities in the world outside of the continent of Africa and the country of Brazil. And in any New York City school right now, you will find racially Black children from extraordinarily ethnically diverse communities, which means that while while New York City remains the most racially segregated school system in the nation, our predominantly Black schools are often the most diverse schools ethnically, by ethnicity and nationality. And so, and this is no shade to anyone fighting for integration of our schools. That is a worthy cause, but I would be remiss if I did not say we should also put more emphasis into equitably funding the ethnically diverse schools we already have. So saying that all to say that our communities have always been diverse. We have always been multiracial. And in fact, the mention of the one drop rule is kind of proof to that. This is a legal principle that was created because white slave owners were creating so many multiracial children through the then legalized rape of Black women, and then keeping those children born from those rapes enslaved. So, you know, we take on the umbrella of Blackness as we experience American racism in this country. And for immigrant communities of African descent, they come here as Jamaican, as did my mother, Nigerian, Ashanti, so forth, in terms of nationality and ethnicity. And for them, a Black American is often, it's considered its own ethnic grouping, one with which they might share racial affinity, but not strong ethnic or cultural ties. And they, like every other immigrant group in this country, are taught that Black Americans are the bottom of society, a group to be avoided. Black Americans, like every other group in this country, are taught that people of African descent are undesirable and to be avoided. And so you layer that on top of the traditional challenges that are present whenever you have immigrant populations gathering. And it is a recipe that could be considered ripe for challenge or ripe for opportunity. But to your the specific question, though, of it's to the challenges, is unifying all of that and being able to cut through all of that so that we are able to operate, organize, work together, collaborate, build, engage in community repair as a group that is experiencing race in America, while recognizing that we can also respect our ethnic and national differences and use that also as a tool to further make the rest of our communities better.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Michael, you and the Brennan Center have been at the forefront of advocating for fair representation of quote unquote minority communities who may live in very diverse settings. And I'm wondering, how should we be organizing the political representation under conditions of what the late David Dinkins used to call the gorgeous mosaic, in which whites are not a majority, but neither is any other group? And, you know, how can the increasing diversity of the population, not just among those of African descent, but across all the different groups, you know, find ways to come together and develop and advance a common agenda?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here today. That's an interesting question, and also a series of questions, and it's also a contentious series of questions, because I think we are at an inflection point in our country in terms of the legal framework for representation and how we think about representation. And I think we're coming up on what is going to be a really robust debate about how we best represent communities, and there are a number of reasons for that. But you know, I will start by simply pointing out that the principal tool that we oftentimes use for ensuring fair representation, the Voting Rights Act, was built really for a very different world. It was designed for a literally black and white world where most of the country was either black or white, and the Black population was then heavily in the South, to a much greater degree than it is even today. And there were almost like no Latinos, there were almost no Asians in the country. That's not the world that we live in today. It's also, the Voting Rights Act was built for a world where people basically were segregated into district-sized units. And so, you know, creating a Black district, you know, or even a Latino district in places like South Texas was not that hard, right? You know, you just draw any kind of district according to neutral principles and you get there. But today we live in a world where most people of color in the country now, in the metro areas of the country, now live in the suburbs, not in the cities. And that's true for every ethnic group. And they live really very much intermixed with each other to a much higher degree. Like even where you have, you know, a predominantly or plurality Black neighborhood, it's adjacent to a plurality Latino neighborhood near white neighborhoods. And so, you know, it's much harder to use the Voting Rights Act to draw districts in that kind of environment. And I think, you know, we're kind of coming up against that, but also like, I think there have been political changes, right? You know, this is not the world of 1965. It is much easier for people of color across the board oftentimes particularly Black candidates, to form coalitions, to put together coalitions that are very diverse, that include Latinos and Asians and even white voters. And you see that in New York City, where people like Mondaire Jones have been really successful in places that you wouldn't think, a few years ago, you wouldn't have thought that a Black candidate could. And that's true, even in the South. Lucy McBath won in a district that is only about 19% Black in Georgia. And so there are many more pathways to power. And I think that has sort of encouraged people to think about what the future of power looks like. But the other thing is, of course, the courts, I think, are increasingly skeptical about race-based remedies. And so we're going to come up on a, and may completely carve back on that. The court is going to hear the affirmative action cases in October, then it's going to hear a case Alabama where it could basically gut what remains of the Voting Rights Act as applied to redistricting. And so I think, we're coming up on a really robust debate about how to best represent communities of color, both because the traditional tools may not be there anymore because of courts, but also because the traditional tools don't work very well and sort of are premised on assumptions about, that you really need ultra Black districts or something like that to win, which just is not increasingly the case. And, maybe I think people are going to think about like outside the box sort of ways to better represent this very diverse multiracial America that really is the future.
Michael, wow, that's so important what you said, and kind of sketching out the future terrain that we'll have to be working on together. I want to just let any of the panelists who would like to react to anything that each of you has said already to maybe raise any questions or responses that are on your mind if you have something to say. Lurie, for example, I'd be very curious as to hear your reaction to what Michael just laid out, given that we've just been through a process of redistricting not only the central city but the suburbs, and I know you've been in active discussion with a lot of people around the state about that.
So it actually feels like justification for the Unity Map Coalition. The Unity Map Coalition, which we at the Center for Law and Social Justice were a part of in coalition with Latino Justice PROGA and the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. And this was a subsequent effort to engage in redistricting from an equity perspective, which is why I quipped a little bit, John, that's why we do not redistrict based on racial lines. We draw lines for maps in the districts based on communities of interest. Who are we voting with? Who are the groups that have like interests in common within this community? And how do we group them in such a way that we are not disempowering or diluting their vote and allowing them to show up in a way at the ballot box that they can choose elected candidates of their choice. They can advocate for policies of their choosing that are going to meet their needs. But this effort, the Unity Map Coalition effort, is born out of decades of work between the aforementioned organizations to do just that, to center equity in our civic engagement when it comes to voting rights. We are the leading legal civil rights organizations for those groups in this city, and we do so with a racial justice lens that allows us to ensure that we are not fighting for equality, because we don't all need the same thing. Our communities are not equally suffering and harmed. We need equity, and we need equitable access to opportunity. We need equitable access to resources. And we need to be able to engage civically in a way that is going to allow our voices to be heard and our desires for community leadership to be reflected. And so I think Reverend Dr. William Barber is a living example of the importance of fusion politics. What we saw happen in Georgia, it, yes, was Black voters, but it was Black voters in coalition with Latino voters, with Asian voters, with Indigenous voters, with Native voters. And so those are that's the way forward. We have a lot of work to do intra-communally in between groups of color. I'll note that white is also a color, but that does not mean that it does mean that we also have an opportunity to ensure that how we are fighting for equity is going to also leave our democracy that much more empowered.
Jenifer, I wonder if I can ask you, based on your qualitative and up close study of people who are multiracial and who may be living in more suburban settings, certainly more than half the immigrants in the United States live outside of central cities, and even I think at this point, more than half of the poor population in poverty lives outside of cities. And so, you know, suburbs are becoming, like central cities, much different than, you know, our sort of 1950s image of them. And I'm wondering how that, you know, how those changes sort of translate into lived experience for the people that you're working with and studying.
So if I understand the question correctly, how does
we don't have
this-
a sort of Ozzie and Harriet suburbs anymore, and so how is race or racial difference being processed in an environment that's much more diverse than it used to be, and even the, you know, the racial categorization of the people is not, you know, so clear cut as the past that, you know, that Michael was talking about at the start of the voting rights period in 1965.
Well, that's a wonderfully rich question. I think on one hand, we could think about this in terms of, you know, yes, of course, we're not living in an Ozzie and Harriet world anymore, and not just because the suburbs are becoming more diverse, but, you know, class matters too, right? And so we've got communities that are divided along race and class lines. And so where the multiracial family fits in, and I did want to, you know, agree with Richard in terms of the sense of what multiracial means now compared to what it used to mean. Certainly, you know, now that interracial marriage has been legal for over 50 years, clearly mixed race families are more likely to be composed of two parents who are married, or, you know, or children who are tied to their families in ways that obviously wasn't the case in the 40s and 50s and before. And so those families are living in the suburbs, and they're living in neighborhoods that are more integrated than segregated. I think where this becomes interesting is that many multiracial people are experiencing neighborhood outcomes that are quite distinct from their single race, their minority counterparts. So, you know, Black, white families are often living in neighborhoods that are less segregated than what's experienced by African-American, solidly African-American families. Asian white families are living in neighborhoods that are almost entirely white, which is very different from the families that, or the neighborhoods that Asian-only families are living in. And so that becomes a really interesting sort of landscape of socialization for mixed race people, that they're exposed to either more diverse or even more homogeneously white environments than their peers, and that has lots of implications for identities. But also it suggests something about their own experiences in terms of representing sort of racial difference in those spaces, and how these communities that, while, you know, segregation is certainly declining, it's certainly still with us. And, you know, mixed race people, even though there's more of them, they still are not necessarily concentrated. They don't necessarily represent a concentrated population in most communities, unless you're talking about Hawaii or, you know, California. And so, you know, these are individuals who are carrying the load of sort of introducing racial difference to many of these communities, depending on where they are. And so I think it does raise this interesting question about, you know, how how neighborhoods are, or how multiracial people are sort of foreshadowing what racial difference can look like and how it can be experienced. I would also say that being, you know, mixed race in sort of a suburban context is interesting because, you know, on one hand, you might be viewed as a racial exception. And to what degree is your sort of racial self sort of tied to, you know, a broader racial community remains an open question. A lot of mixed race people who grow up in mostly white environments end up either attaching themselves to non-white communities because they face lots of discrimination there. And so it's not necessarily that, you know, the mixed race person comes in and magically racism just doesn't happen. It actually does happen, and in some ways becomes very clarified. And that person ends up folding themselves into totally different communities because they don't feel like they can actually be comfortable there. So that's the sort of long rambling answer that it's obviously very complicated, but, you know, racial inequality and racial sort of interpersonal discrimination still manifests even in the sort of mixed race circumstance.
been talking about broad patterns in the country as a whole across metro areas. We're all passionate New Yorkers. Even Jenifer, as a Texan, has that passion for New York inside her. I know. What does all this imply for the future of New York City? We've had many racially polarized elections going back to, Ed Koch in 1977 at the municipal level. And the most recent election was also, racially polarized in the sense that in the Democratic primary, the share of the white voters in a given election district and voting for white candidates was very high, and the correlation between the share of African-American voters and voting for Eric Adams was also very high. And it was interesting that it didn't seem to be as racially provocative as David Dinkins' election was so many years ago. So the fact that it was racially polarized was sort of, well, that's the way it is, but it's not that important, and let's on to the new administration. Maybe that's partly because Eric Adams is a former policeman and was being tough on crime and sounding a little bit like some of the themes that Rudy Giuliani ran on. But we have a city in which native-born whites with native-born white parents are less than 1 in 5 residents of the city. So we're well past the idea that white people would be a majority of the population or the electorate in the city, decades past that. And so I'm just wondering what you see these evolving, reshaping of the contours of race and ethnicity mean for how we as a city, can come together and, consolidate behind an agenda that we all have developed and agree on. So anybody who wants to say anything about that is welcome to. Richard, you're laughing. Is it?
Well, because I don't think that, I think New York is still a very segregated city on the national landscape. And so, we're far from the gorgeous mosaic that David Dinkins envisioned, back at the very end of the last century. I think, racial inequality is very sharply profiled in New York City when, a very big part of the white population is quite affluent. And poor New Yorkers are overwhelmingly Black and Latino. I think we're not a microcosm of the United States. Beyond the Melting Pot, the Glaser Moynihan book made readers feel as if, well, they were really learning something about the United States by reading about New York City. But I really think we're just really a very different beast. And as you pointed out, John, a lot of what's happening is happening in the suburbs. So a lot of the integration that, for example, is associated with mixed families is happening in the suburbs more than happening in the city. So I'm not sure how to answer your question, but I do agree that it seems like the Eric Adams election was not a huge deal. And people said, okay, that's good, and went on.
I think that one of the interesting things about New York, which I think is in some sense like something interesting about the country, is that we're still seeing a future that is now being shaped by what I call the 1965 generation, the generation of people whose families came to the United States after the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965, when the borders were reopened. And I think that those identities, those political identities are still in some ways being shaped. Those ethnic identities are still being shaped, and they're sort of up for grabs, and not only New York City, but elsewhere. And I think, one of the things that doesn't get talked about nearly enough in a lot of literature is, how this gigantic wave of immigration. And I often tell people, I think in some ways, the Immigration Nationality Act was more profound an act than the Voting Rights Act, both passed in 1965. But it's really the Immigration Act that sort of changes America and gives us this much more diverse America, where we have Thai food and lots of different kinds of people. And I'll to go back to your question earlier, I mean, I think like, and an example of how the political identities are being shaped, like if you look at like surveys of Latinos who have moved to the Texas suburbs, they identify much more, they become more conservative. They identify much more with Republicans, not to a huge degree, but they start to pick, they live closer to people who are different, right? They don't live in heavily Latino neighborhoods to the same extent. They start to pick up, they start to change where they watch their news and their views. And so I think like that future, like the political identity of the future is really up for grabs.
At the same time, Harlem is less than 50% Black today, as is Bedford-Stuyvesant. And if you read the literature on segregation, even a decade or 20 years ago, a mixed neighborhood with whites and Blacks living in it would be in transition to becoming an all-Black neighborhood. And it's not clear how stable the mixture in places like Harlem and Bed-Stuy will be, but just in my having friends who live in those places and spending some time walking around, seeing people gather, this is sort of Lurie's home turf in a way, but there are a lot of very nice spaces, restaurants and so forth, clubs in those neighborhoods where there are a lot of Black people and a lot of white people, and they seem to be enjoying each other's company. So I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, but it does seem to me that, I mean, of course there are stresses and strains, and people are upset that that it's not easy for somebody who grows up in Bedford-Stuyvesant who's Black to to buy one of the nice brownstones that their parents or grandparents might have lived in, or that they might have grown up in, and gentrification is a real issue. But at the same time, it does seem to me that there's more ease of intermixture at a street level and neighborhood way than there used to be. I mean, the Archie Bunkers of New York have left. They're really, even the most diehard outer borough white neighborhood is severely in decline, and we're moving to something different. I want to mention to the audience that in a few minutes we'll turn to questions. So please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll be able to respond to some of them. Yeah. I don't know, perhaps some of you disagree with what I just said.
Yeah, no, I just think it's funny that you said this is my backyard, because it literally is my backyard. My family's home is in Bedford-Stuyvesant. My father grew up, born in Bedford-Stuyvesant, grew up in Harlem. And so yeah, I chuckled a bit when you said that white New Yorkers, native-born white people, are less than 1 in 5, because it doesn't really matter the percentage or the total share of population when you're white. You have power and you have the ability to shift dynamics in communities. And on my block, one of the things we say when we start to see white people come into the neighborhood is they're like the settlers, right? There's a very pioneering spirit within many of our white brethren and sisters. And so going into areas that are considered undesirable for the purposes of reclaiming land is actually a pretty common theme throughout American history. And we see that's literally what gentrification is. And so on my block, in my neighborhood, we did not have a lot of the niceties when it was just people who look like me, who arguably are also disrupting the financial status of the block, right? Like my husband and I, we do very well for ourselves economically. So this is why when people say, well, it's really more of a class issue. No, race transcends class, because race was the gateway through which American class structure was established, which is why you could be a poor white person and still have more authority than a wealthy Black person, both during plantation slavery and today. So it doesn't matter that the numbers of white people are decreasing, because the power of whiteness is such that investment comes and follows settler activity. Resources come, we now have a ramen bar on Malcolm X Boulevard. Like we have French cuisine on Malcolm X Boulevard. We have our wonderful, excellent food. It's amazing. But Black people who are native to that space, whatever that means, sitting on indigenous land, they cannot afford to stay there. And so this settler approach to housing policy, where you can get a condo approved in a heartbeat, but God help you if you're trying to include affordable housing, it is designed to center whiteness in spaces where Blackness is the norm. And that in and of itself creates ripple effects. That means Blackness cannot sustain itself there because we just can't afford it. And so, you know, the idea that, and not to say that white New Yorkers at all are you know, South African apartheid, but I always point to South Africa apartheid to remind us all that numbers and population do not equate with power. And when your power structure is based on centering whiteness and following your investment dollars following whiteness, and your investment in schools following whiteness, and you'll get the hospitals that we lost when Bed-Stuy was Black, we'll get them back now that Bed-Stuy is turning white. That is really the heart. What signals to me that it doesn't matter how much more ethnically diverse our city is becoming, so long as anti-Blackness is sort of at the root of this beast, and so long as centering whiteness is, you know, whatever that means, right? Again, these are man-made concepts that did not exist 500 years ago, but whatever that is, we will have more of the same unless we embrace an equity-driven approach to the distribution and allocation of resources and political power, so that the people who have traditionally been in the most need by design will actually get the most help because they need it by design.
So I don't want to arm wrestle with you necessarily, but it might be pointed out that the speaker of the city council is from Southeast Queens. The mayor is from, we're not exactly sure, but he sort of grew up in Queens and lives in Brooklyn. We have a council that's completely different from, you know, I worked on the redistricting and the charter revision of 89 and redistricting of 91. And, you know, the city council at the end of the Tom Cute era was much as you describe it. But today, women in the majority, lots of strong women of color in the council leading us to the future, you know, not to mention to the mayoralty. If you look at the you know, the leader of the state Senate, the leader of the state assembly, there's a lot of Black empowerment in New York City and New York State that has been achieved through the kinds of struggles that you and Michael and others, and hopefully allies among people like me have, you know, have achieved. So yes, there's still racial discrimination, and yes, there's deep racial inequality, but it does seem to me that we've advanced very considerably in terms of minority. One of the people in the chat said I shouldn't use the word minority because it's white supremacist.
Global majority is not a bad substitute. Global majority is not a bad substitute. But I would say that there's a difference between political power and economic sustainability. Right? We have yet to see, we're still experiencing the wonderful fruits of this most diverse city council. And I am so excited about what that is going to mean. But we have had political empowerment of Black communities before. I'll remind us all about the Reconstruction period, where we had more Black elected officials in the years following the Civil War, I believe arguably than we have right now. And that wasn't just in a city, that was nationwide. But political power and access to holding seats in political power does not always and will not necessarily translate into economic power, which is actually one of the big questionable debates within Pan-African communities. Should we focus as much on political power when we have examples of groups of non-white people who focus more on economic sustainability, and their entree into the political space is that much more empowered because of it? Yes, we can elect Black elected officials. Can we create jobs for Black children? Those are not the same thing, and they require different types.
Jenifer, I see you shaking your head. Yes. What do you want to add? Or
just Lots of yes. I think the first thing that came to mind when we were talking about gentrification is, while we can talk about demographic turnover, the consequences of that demographic turnover are not evenly shared. I mean, what Black communities that have reduced their proportion share have faced is a loss of political power, cultural power. Their, cultural institutions that were stable and kind of centers for communities have become weakened. And I don't think that would be evident in how people are interacting in the day-to-day. Yes, I was born in Brooklyn and lived very close to Bed-Stuy, and it was not a community that a lot of white people would ever go into. That doesn't mean it wasn't vibrant and wasn't important. But as things have changed, and yes, the boutiques are lovely, and yes, all the spaces are really lovely, and people are enjoying them, it has shifted in terms of the kind of cultural and political impact that minoritized communities can have. Basically, being Black and brown and having a real impact in these spaces is not common across the United States. And so spaces where it's present need protection. And so I just wanted to express a lot of agreement with the sort of equity perspective, because that is essentially the perspective that doesn't get as much attention in a sort of discussion of how do we achieve equality. Well, equity requires us to think about what's fair as opposed to what's the same. And so, I just really wanted to express a lot of affirmation for everything that Lurie was saying.
Michael and Richard, do you want to react to this?
Well,
or
the only reaction I have is I think that there's a kind of a dimension to this that is hard to speak about in a way, in a political sense. And that is that I think, and in all the research I've done, I find that immigrant groups, including the post-1965 immigrant groups, have an easier time moving up in American society than African Americans do. And that the brunt, that the heaviest burden of racism, and it has to do with the sort of long kind of life of slavery in a way, even after emancipation, the heaviest burden of racism falls on African Americans. And so it seems to me again that, this way of thinking of our society as kind of white versus non-white really is a kind of false dichotomy, because there are big inequalities among the groups that we think of as non-white. And I think that, the immigrant origin ones, including Latinos, have an easier time ultimately making their way in American society than African Americans do.
Michael?
Except the ones that look Black.
Right?
Right?
Well, no, absolutely. I agree with that. Although, immigrant Blacks, the current immigrant Blacks coming from Africa, and this is something that we don't really have enough good data about, may be doing better than African Americans in the long run. Yeah.
The only thing I will add on that is I think, again, what is happening in New York sort of does play out and have ramifications elsewhere, right? Because, a lot of people have left, a lot of Black people have left New York City and have moved, out to the suburbs, right? And the country, there is a significant Black migration from northern cities, including New York, to the South, in places like Dallas and Atlanta. Like the Black population in the Dallas area has grown by very significant margins. I mean, people think of Texas as being like a fast growing Latino state, but really the Black population, it's the fastest growing Black population in the country outside of Florida. And so what is happening in New York with all of these movements actually is sort of helping to transform some of the politics elsewhere in the country. And and where Black people are moving to the South, they're not moving to the cities, they're moving to the suburbs. So
as I analyze the correlates of the vote in the Democratic primary last June, and I mentioned some of the strong racial correlations, but there's also a very, very, as many of us have already said, class has a color all over the US and in New York City. But there was a very strong income gradient in terms of who supported whom. And it's rather remarkable that Eric Adams was able to win a majority with lots of his votes coming from low income people, and knowing that lower income people are less likely to turn out and vote in a primary than upper income people. And that one of the comments in the Q&A is maybe we should stop talking about race and ethnic differentiation, which would tend to fragment us and perhaps put us in competition with each other or in conflict with each other, and talk more about class commonalities. And in that sense, Adams' victory in the Democratic primary shows how, Latino low-income voters supported him, and there weren't enough Black votes to win that election. It had to be something that was cutting across. I mean, the fact that he talked about himself as the blue-collar candidate, the person that really understood what was going on the streets of your neighborhood, I think really evoked a response, a widespread positive response through the city. And so I'm just curious about your thoughts about, the unifying theme of inequality and class inequality versus the potentially dividing emphasis on racial membership and competing racial groups.
Well, I
Lurie,
will just say,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Go right ahead. No.
I will just say, I think that points to a central truth about our politics today, which is that they are increasingly becoming multiracial, multi-ethnic, and coalitional, right?
Exactly.
The group that wins the future will be the group that can put together a coalition, however that is organized, right?
Yeah.
Because, and Republicans aren't very good at it right now, but they, that is the future, right? I mean, you will win the suburbs if you can put together a multiracial coalition. You will win in places like New York if you put together a multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition, however you can sort of center that. And I think the political identities of many of the people, particularly from the 1965 generation, are still up for grabs. So this is all I think the next few years or the next few decades are going to be really interesting.
So one of the things that I'm reminded of as I listen to your comment, Michael, is when you talk about the coalition, and I think you're dead on, you're spot on there. That's absolutely how I see it. But I'm reminded that this is happening in the midst of a real exponential increase in white nationalist activity. And the reason I'm reminded of this is because for those of you who are not familiar with the story of Wilmington, North Carolina, which again, I believe it's 1898, very late 1898, right. Very late 1800s, a very diverse, class transcending of sorts coalition effort, poor whites, Black formerly enslaved and Black freed persons, abolitionists working together in unison, well, not unison, but working together and really overwhelming the political and electoral process such that they were able to sweep the seats in terms of the seats that were up for grabs during that election. And they were sworn into office, many, and what happened after that was a wave of white national violence that drove those Black elected officials, the white elected officials who were on that ticket, drove them out of town, and quite frankly, the people who did the driving out of town with massive amounts of wanton violence and destruction of those Black communities, well, they just assumed those positions of the people that they had just forcibly vacated. And there was a time where this conversation might have seen a little bit, or this portion of the conversation might have seen a bit hyperbolic, but I think what we are seeing across the nation is that we are not in hyperbolic times. We are literally reliving the end of Reconstruction as applied to the integration era. And so even as we're thinking about the beauty and the potential in this multiracial, multicultural mosaic that is at our potential, this is not the first time that we have seen those sort of gathering of forces. And so if we are not also, in addition to our advocacy for equitable distribution of resources and political power, if we are not also mounting a real defense against the rise in white nationalism, then we will easily see that the end of that democracy and the end of those efforts, which can literally come overnight. And we do not have a history of people who engage in coups d'etats or attempted insurrections actually being punished for it. A history one might suggest is being we lived right now. And so there is a lot of potential here, but American democracy is both participatory and requires active advancing and an offensive effort to protect it. And I don't know that we're quite seeing that necessary component. So while I am optimistic, I'm also mindful of the times in which we live and think that we would be remiss to not also be clear that those elements are ripe and abundant in the Big Apple as well.
Just sort of a couple of reactions. I mean, I think your point is extremely well taken, that we need to worry about the foundations of democracy in this country, and we need to worry about the rise of white nationalism. And so it seems to me that one sort of political problem that has not been very well addressed is that the Democratic Party has let the white working class, to come back to class, slip away into the hands of Republicans. And I think that the Democratic, one way of sort of addressing then this white nationalism is to bring back some of the white working class into the Democratic fold. I mean, the decline of union, there are a number of forces behind this, including the decline of unions. But the other thing to bear in mind is that demographically speaking, we're at an extremely different moment in the national life than we were in 1898 when Wilmington took place. And we're really into a transition from sort of a white-dominated society to an extremely diverse society represented by young people, much more diverse than their elders. And one implication of that is that young, diverse Americans, people coming from mixed backgrounds, from Black, Hispanic, and Asian backgrounds, are advancing socioeconomically in this country into the top tiers of the workforce in a way that simply hasn't been true before. And this reflects the kind of demographic shift in which there really are not enough young whites to replace the whites who are leaving from high-level positions. Sorry.
Yes, that's some of Richard's other really excellent work. And Richard, you've talked about non-zero sum upward mobility, where the people of the white males of our generation are receding from the scene, and there's not enough of people like us to take our places. So inevitably there's going to be a shift in the composition of the managerial professional strata of the country. But I think your work shows that African-American males are the least likely to succeed to those positions.
No, that's right. That this African-Americans are certainly making progress in terms of their penetration into the top tiers of the workforce, but not to the same degree as the immigrants and their descendants, both Asian and Latino, are doing so.
And for that matter,
but I think the point here is that there's really a big shift taking place in terms of not just the political leadership, but also the economic leadership of the country.
So I think we have a closing question. Well, actually, I'm seeing that we're at 8:30, so in 2 minutes, we're going to come to the end electronically of our meeting, whether we like it or not. We could go on for quite a long time, I think. But so if any of you have closing words that you would like to share with us, please do so now. And I want to thank everybody for an absolutely, fascinating, wide-ranging conversation that has taught me a lot. So I very much appreciate your being here.
I really appreciate the insights of all the panelists. I've learned a lot from our conversation. I thank you.
Ditto.
Likewise.
So
Me too.
I'll just close out by saying, look at our other programs and our public programs. We have a lot of terrific ones. And I personally want to, thank the Graduate Center for being such a great platform for all of us grappling with the very central issues that face our city and our country. And it's a fantastic place. It's a gem that we should keep well polished. And so thanks again, and we'll see you at another event soon. Take care. Anyone else have a final a final word or two before the plug is pulled? Okay. Thank you to the Graduate Center for launching this.
Yeah, thank you.